Dear participants, good morning. It's my pleasure to address you today and talk about the impact of COVID on the JSI negotiations on e-commerce. As I speak, the number of COVID cases globally approaches 40 million mark. The pandemic gained speed. Nevertheless, every challenge is also a chance. As pertinently noted by Machiavelli, never was anything great achieved without danger. With this attitude in mind, let me move to the outline of my today's intervention. I will proceed in 4 steps. First, I will introduce selected peculiarities of the urgent e-commerce enabling induced by the pandemic. Secondly, I will briefly address the JSI dynamics during the COVID times. Next, in by far the most interesting part of my presentation, and probably the longest, I will touch upon the specific JSI topics impacted by the COVID-19, offering some concluding remarks thereafter. Let me start by linking our today's discussion to the notion of e-commerce enabling as we have discussed it in mid-June. At that meeting, we have looked at enabling as something making e-commerce possible and operational. To a certain extent, COVID has assisted in fulfilling these tasks. As a matter of a metaphor, the e-commerce progress during COVID, pretty much everywhere globally, but even more so in developing countries and LDCs, could be compared to a ride on an ambulance. A very speedy ride without much respect to traffic rules, if those even exist. The sufficient ride in the case of COVID is, however, confined to the limits of domestic markets, as per the picture that you see, which shows a border between Switzerland and France, next to which I live, in late March. These relevant events could be somewhat less creatively reflected on the digital economy and society index scale. As the use of internet services became indispensable, digital technology started to integrate itself further into our lives. This led to unexpected yet significant development in some segments of human capital, largely through self-help, and some progress on the side of emerging digital governance programs followed. What is lagging behind so far is connectivity, which seems to await better times for its eventual growth. Nevertheless, the progress in e-commerce has to be measured against several other trends. Among those, drastic decline in human development index values, decrease in the inflow of foreign direct investments being bound to continue for at least 1 more year in the most optimistic scenario. The COVID-induced poverty, among the most simple implications of which inability of domestic markets to absorb the potential of booming e-commerce development within. The fracturing of value chains and finally, still uncertain latest WTO recovery forecast for international trade, both in goods and in services. Despite the uncontestable progress with self-enabling of the e-commerce ecosystem, the impact of COVID-19 on the JSI could be seen as dilatory. It also underscored the acute transparency deficit. Even if the stocktake text was communicated to the WTO membership in mid-August 2020, no other updates on the work in the small groups or in plenary were communicated since March 2020. The silence of the JSI makes those curious about e-commerce search for the relevant news elsewhere. Here, among the notable recent developments at the conclusion of Australia-Singapore Digital Economy Agreement, some of the rules of which are already reflected in the stocktake text, and the advancement of the e-commerce protocol to be of the African Free Trade area, continental free trade area, from phase 3 to the phase 2 of the negotiations, which nevertheless are expected to be starting for this phase in early 2021. COVID has impacted pretty much any issue discussed in the JSI, even if mostly nationally. Consequently, the selection of the issues which I will touch upon next is demonstrative and by no means exhaustive. Starting from e-transactions facilitation, a clear front runner is social media e-commerce, reflected in different layers, like the one you see on the screen, or a bit more technically sophisticated solutions. Besides a clear boost of business to consumer and consumer e-commerce, which this development show, they also raise important issues related, for instance, to identification of the parties, vendor registration, and eventual taxation. They're also adding spotlight to privacy concerns and shake once again the limits of trust. Consumer-centered development could also be easily traced in the domain of e-payments. Here, cash is still the king. However, e-payments gradually gain ground, being a mean of distribution of stimulus packages and social assistance, and occasionally replacing cash through electronic wallets in the cash on delivery setting. Moreover, simplification in recording and reporting of financial transactions by e-means, or by reference to the records available electronically, for instance, even in a cell phone, is another remarkable attraction. The world is still far from the digitized beggar from China, but technologically speaking, it is steadily moving in this direction. A recent e-commerce survey conducted by the UNCTAD and the new Swiss Observatory has once again attested divergent preferences with respect to payment mechanisms. The differences here are caused by the level of bankarization, digitalization, cashlessness, trust. Considering the above, orientation on interoperability of payment solutions rather than their unification remains an obvious policy choice. Meanwhile, the payment evolution towards contactless and cashless dimensions is clearly in progress, with a very recent digital yuan trial in Shenzhen, among others. Some of the issues that this development brings in are the need to regulate fintechs, anti-fraud strategy, user identification once again, and in essence also de facto fragmentation of arrangements adopted by payment service providers to ensure the regulatory compliance globally. The new rules in the area of e-payment could be found in Australia-Singapore Digital Economy Agreement. Among those, a call for standardization of electronic payments, ensuring interoperability, and encouraging innovation through resort to industry sandboxes, among others. Another very noticeable COVID-induced development is an enhanced attention to e-taxation. It is clear that the revenue collection interests of the states become more pronounced during the pandemic. The proposed solutions, however, vary with VAT and withholding tax, as for instance suggested recently by Thailand, positioned at the very top of the agenda. A shift has also happened in the developments underlying e-consumer protection rules and approaches. Here, according to UNCTAD, a survey that I was referring to already before, consumers tend to shop more online, while in the meantime spending less. One oversimplified explanation of the same could be found in the shift in the needs as reflected in Maslow's pyramid, from those focusing on personal growth down to the layers ensuring survival. Another notable trend is increased attention to deliveries, which would make e-trade facilitation especially relevant and active during post-COVID reopening phase. Finally, COVID made consumers more open to new experiences, while the new digital habits, as shown again in the same UNCTAD survey, are here to stay. The free data flows have suffered a major blow in the past months as the two Europe-US privacy shields have fallen one after the other. With the discussion on sufficiency of protection of private data and ensuring its security actively ongoing, a portfolio of mostly ad hoc solutions are relied on the case-by-case basis. Enforcement of data rules and segregation and depersonalization of data remain, meanwhile, high on the agenda. On a more positive note, the situation has resulted in some creative solutions, for instance, by Bahrain, which has essentially defeated data flow restrictions by subjecting data stored within its territory to the substantive law and jurisdiction of the originator. It remains to be seen if this recent practice would prove to be productive in the longer term. In the area of privacy, consent remains essential. However, implementation of the relevant rules is not always consistent and reassuring. To draw some examples, it might be argued that there is a difference between understanding and consent. Also, it is becoming better pronounced that the free consent should not be grounded in the fear of exclusion. The sign up or leave it policy of Facebook is demonstrative in such respect. You can see a snapshot of this policy in here, where you have to agree on the cookies and data protection policy as the condition of joining the network. Finally, the privacy concerns are also pronounced in the context of the COVID tracing applications, especially against the background of several recent data breaches. In the light of this traits mentioned, this Facebook future telling that you see on the slide before you now appears somewhat over-optimistic. COVID also has caused a breakthrough with respect to sharing open governmental data. Even if not yet duly sorted and so not necessarily searchable, now it appears online and mechanisms ensuring its updates are worked out. Even more so, governments try to explain their regulatory steps virtually and often quite creatively. The discussions on the moratorium go on with a dedicated workshop in mid-July having offered a good exchange of analytical inputs, albeit underscoring conflicting results. While intuitively the pandemic should have had a boosting effect on trade and digitized goods, the relevant facts and implications are yet to be assessed. Production of the goods covered by the ITA and ITA expansion has maintained certain growth all through the pandemic, even during the most challenging sanitary times, and now accelerates. Finally, consolidation within the digital giants accentuates the antitrust concerns even more. Arguably, the leverage is further reinforced through the efforts of the groups in supporting COVID recovery. To conclude, I would like to make three remarks. First of all, the role of the governments in e-commerce ecosystems, including their trade-related aspects, remains poorly defined, ranging from operator at the highest to observer at the lowest. Next, it is reasonable to expect that with the improvement in sanitary situation, new or amended national and regional e-commerce regulatory solutions would emerge. Finally, it remains to be seen if a bottom-up approach accounting for the ideas of newly digitized states or a top-down approach inducing such states into using rules already elaborated and in use elsewhere would prevail. In the slide, the role of the JSI with respect to most of the issues on its agenda is likely in shaping broad lines while also accounting for the work accomplished elsewhere and ensuring technological and regulatory interoperability, connectivity, data portability, and cooperation. To conclude with a final relevant remark, enabling of e-commerce, in a sense, we have outlined at the beginning of this presentation, both with respect to ecosystems and contributing to participation in the JSI negotiations, should not stop at this point despite important developments in e-commerce area. It should continue for as long as it will be needed and as long as JSI negotiations would require. Thank you very much for your attention.